Turnout at Zimbabwe's election, the first since the removal of former President Robert Mugabe, averaged 75%, larger than the last vote in 2013. Electoral Commission Chair Priscilla Chigumba has told reporters in Harare that it is their view that the high voter turnout is indicative of a sound voter education and publicity conducted on a receptive electorate. While Dr. Showers Mawowa is the Deputy Director of the civil society organization Southern African Liaison Office, and he joins us now from our Pretoria studio. Doctor, thank you very much for your time and welcome to SABC News. While voting in Zim is done and dusted, perhaps for many Zimbabweans, it's been quite a surreal experience. Now the hard work starts for Zimbabwe's civil society. In your view, has this election been free and fair? And are you satisfied with how the election was conducted?
Well, I'm struggling a bit to hear you, but I mean, in terms of how the election has, the reports we are hearing so far, logistically, have gone well. Not many reports of of violence or any intimidation. That most of the polling stations opened at time. Person was joking to me saying all of the voting stations except for one, which opened 5 minutes later. It just goes to show that at logistics, I think all has gone well. For the one unfortunate incident that reported earlier on, who passed away while on the queue to vote. I can only express my condolences to the family and the relatives.
This election has been for the most part considered smooth and peaceful, with just a general feeling of excitement for a new dawn. The road leading up to this election has in places been tainted by some of the same old hurdles experienced in past elections, with claims of irregularities, accusations of flouting of electoral laws, etc. What are some of the observations that you can make looking back at past elections and this current one?
Well, I think the aspect of the election being violent-free, that is necessarily new. In 2008, we had relatively violent-free elections and also had relatively violent-free elections in 2013. What has been new is the extent it has been able to reach so-called hitherto unentered areas. And of course, the fact that a very long campaign period for the opposition political party, hence they've been able to have 5 rallies. Quite marked. We also have not had national observers specifically being allowed to Zimbabwe's elections since 2000. So that is quite distinct. I think the level of international scrutiny is quite high in this particular election. And of course, there are other circumstantial issues around this election, which is the fact that it's coming after a coup, and for the first time you don't have Mugabe on the ballot paper. Secondly, you also don't have Morgan Tsvangirai, the two men who have dominated Zimbabwe's politics for the past 20 years.
Doctor, what chance do you think this election will provide for many Zimbabweans who are outside the country to perhaps consider returning and rekindling what many may say is a tumultuous relationship, with their birth country?
Well, I think it depends on the outcome of the election. So the mood in the country and among people in the diaspora is one of anticipation. People looking forward to an outcome that will create conditions for people to go back home And I think a lot of people will adopt a wait-and-see attitude and take the opportunity to go home if the conditions allow. So it will depend very much on the outcome. And it's clear when you gauge the sentiments among people in the diaspora, people in the urban areas, people are looking for a real new dispensation where you have new political actors, in fact, leading the country. If one is to judge by the response by the diasporas up until now, they are clearly not looking to go back home if the election produces a result that is a continuity.
And yet there were so many Zimbabwean nationals reported not to have even bothered to come back home to vote. But moving on, Doctor, how can civil society help to perhaps ensure that this buzz of hope that was in the air when former President Robert Mugabe finally stepped down under military pressure, and that buzz that is still there with the anticipation that you speak of from today's election not only lives on, but is an actual lived experience for Zimbabweans?
You mean for Zimbabweans in the diaspora or Zimbabweans in Zimbabwe?
Zimbabweans in Zimbabwe.
Okay, so are you asking about what has changed since the military intervention, or what others choose to call the military coup in November?
I'm talking about the buzz, the sense of hope, the sense of a new dawn that will come. What role can civil society play in trying to hold the government and perhaps leaders in the SADC region sort of responsible, or to hold them to account to ensure that Zimbabweans remain hopeful and that they're taken out of this current position and are ushered into a new Zimbabwe, a Zimbabwe that has hope, a Zimbabwe that can bring about economic growth and stability and so forth? Is there a role that civil society can play in ensuring that becomes a lived experience for Zimbabweans?
That's a very important question, because during the campaign season, a lot of promises have been made by the political parties that have been campaigning. So the expectations are quite high on what the government ought to deliver post-elections. And I think for me, that's going to be very important, even when you want to consider the long-term political stability of Zimbabwe. You may actually encounter a crisis of expectations. So the role of the SADC will be important. Firstly, across the political divide, there is consensus that the economy needs to be fixed. So there has to be a quick turnaround as far as addressing the cash crisis, for example. And that would require massive investment into the country. A lot of stabilization as well is needed for the financial sector. And Zimbabwe's economic recovery depends very much on the support of the international community, the support of the region, and the inflow of foreign direct investment. But beyond that is also the question that is of big interest for us as civil society, which is around the consolidation of democracy. Our concern at the moment is that the democratization and the human rights agenda is receding as far as Zimbabwe is concerned. There seems to be a preoccupation with stability, throwing the issues of democracy and human rights to the periphery. So one would call upon the region to support the building of strong institutions in Zimbabwe. No matter who comes into power, as long as the institutions are weak, then you have a problem. The military intervention that we had in November is a reminder that the question of security sector reform is critical in Zimbabwe. And I think it's going to be one of the issues that Zimbabwe has to deal with the support of the region. South Africa has a very good experience in terms of strengthening institutions. We have seen how institutions have been tested and have proven to be resilient. And I think for Zimbabwe to build a sustainable democracy, it is important to invest in strong institutions that support democracy and protection of human rights.
Now, Doctor, there, of course, has been and still is a lot of international focus, a lot of international eyes looking at this election, pre and post. Do you think that the international community will be keen to re-engage Zimbabwe despite whichever leader emerges victorious? Because whoever it's going to be will certainly have to hit the ground running with promoting economic growth and working towards bringing about that economic stability we were talking about. But do you also think that the international community is concerned about the issues of democracy and ensuring that people are able to access their basic rights?
So, I mean, like I said, in terms of democracy and human rights, we are quite concerned because the international community seems to have accepted that you need stability at all costs, and democracy and human rights are secondary, to the extent that everyone is willing to wink at the military coup that occurred in November and call it a military facilitated transition. But it is a coup, and calling it otherwise has been for convenience. And one hopes that we deal with the elephant in the room as far as Zimbabwe is concerned, which is the role of the military in civilian affairs, as something that needs to be addressed. But I have no doubt that as far as economic re-engagement is concerned, international investors are waiting, looking forward to a stable Zimbabwe. And when I say stable Zimbabwe, that means politically stable. It may not be a democratic Zimbabwe, it may not be a Zimbabwe that supports human rights, but as long as there's political certainty and stability, you are going to see a lot of investors coming in. We have already seen over this short period since November, a lot of deals have been signed, some of which have been opaque, which have not been subjected to parliamentary scrutiny, raising a lot of concerns from socio-economic justice activists in Zimbabwe.
All right, Doctor, my final question to you. We're looking at opinion polls, and although they don't necessarily reflect or indicate the true nature of how things will be, but more and more it does seem as if this election is tight between opposition leaders and that it's not leaning towards one particular ZANU-PF, for instance. Now, does the civil society have any fears that of any tensions that may arise from a particular party, perhaps being determined to hold on to power post the results?
Yeah, so the opinion polls are suggesting that this is a tightly contested election. We have seen the gap narrowing between the incumbent and the main opposition rival to only 3%. So there's no doubt that it's going to be a closely fought election. In terms of the possible scenarios that will unfold post the announcements of the result, what is of concern? Of course, a lot of people have asked the question of whether the military will accept an opposition victory. I have a different take on that because the fear is that the military will block any transition to the opposition. But I think it will depend. I don't foresee the military being able to block that after a result has been announced. The options for disruptive elements would be to stop the results from being announced. But once the results have been announced, I don't see how disruptive elements can stop a transfer of power to the opposition. A situation that I think could create a stable and unstable post-election situation could be where the incumbent wins. We may see the opposition, they have already declared that they are not going to accept a result won by the incumbent. And it's because over the process in the run-up to the election, they have built what I think is a solid case for disputing any result that does not favor them. If you look at problems with the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, lacking transparency in the process, the role of chiefs, media coverage, a lot of violations of the electoral law. So there is a strong case for the opposition to dispute the outcome. And I think they have built evidence for that. And I think the disruptive elements may actually come from the opposition refusing a result that does not favor them, and how the security sector and the incumbent will then respond to the opposition protesting the electoral outcome. And I think that's where the source of instability is. But one hopes that whatever outcome may emerge, Zimbabwe will be able to work out and work together, because Zimbabwe has been in a state of uncertainty, caught up in this trap of illegitimate for a long period of time. And I think everyone should agree that Zimbabwe must move on.
Certainly, Doctor. Thank you very much for your time. Speaking to us, there is Dr. Showers Mawowa, who is the Deputy Director of the Southern African Liaison Office. And of course, he was coming to us live from our Pretoria Studio.